Welcome everybody to this edition of Behind the Curtain. This series is dedicated to the makers and shakers who are not out on the stage, behind a microphone, playing lead guitar. These are the people who are not the stars, but people who make careers of stars possible. Made the great hits and the great albums possible.
That's right.
And we're looking at people like songwriters and producers. Among the great unsung heroes are the session players, of course. And today we're going to be looking at one of the legendary groups of session players from Los Angeles, known as the Wrecking Crew.
Yeah, the Wrecking Crew, the best of the session players in LA. This would be early 60s to mid 60s. This is really when the music industry had shifted to the West Coast, to Los Angeles specifically. For years, of course, popular music, frankly, decades, popular music was in New York. It was very much a kind of East Coast enterprise. But
I think of the Brill Building, stuff like that. Yeah,
absolutely. So like everyone, California became a destination. And so pop music shifted west. A number of key recording studios became important. And what happened over the span of a few years was that a number of musicians found themselves getting more and more gigs, studio musicians found themselves getting more and more gigs, and they assembled and became to kind of a tight-knit unit, a unit that bore the nickname the Wrecking Crew.
Right, and there's some controversy about just how much that moniker was actually applied back in the day. Carol Kay, the fantastic bass player of the Wrecking Crew, she recalls them being called the Click.
Yeah.
And says the Wrecking Crew was basically an invention of Hal Blaine to self-promote in his book, 1980. But different people have different recollections about when they were hearing that, if they were using it, and so on and so forth.
That's right.
And they are now known as the Wrecking Crew. That's there's no question about it.
No question about the nickname stuck, and really for the past 55 years, 60 years, the Wrecking Crew has been used to describe a kind of floating band of studio musicians. There were some key core members, but these people played on everything. And so one of the interesting things about pop music in the early 1960s was that what ended up happening was that you had a number of sort of people in the background who would be playing on one album after the next. Well, of course, there would be different people out front singing. It tended to be that the same musicians were playing, backing these musicians, song after song after song. And so at some point in the early to mid 1960s, seemingly almost every hit that you would hear on the radio would be being played by these musicians, the Wrecking Crew musicians from LA.
And just a word about session players and about sessions. Yeah. This is something that is unknown in the music industry today. You don't get together for a session to create a song or a hit. Everybody does their own thing. Everybody does their own track. For the most part, really on their own. You seriously have some parts being emailed from one place to another and then put together by a central producer.
Sure.
But back in the day, multi-track recording, although it had been around for a while, was still not commercially viable. And demos of songs would be printed on acetate, so that you could just put it on a record player and have it and hear what was going on, hear what it was about, and so on. But the actual recordings were done on tape. And back in the early 60s, most of the singles that were being singles and albums that were being recorded and published were being put out on mono instead of stereo. There weren't even really stereo players until like the mid 60s.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And so with the advent of stereo, then more sophisticated techniques within the studio became not only important, but became available. And in a sense, in the 1960s, technology, multi-track tape machines, for example, allowed people within the studio to do more in the studio. And it actually then allowed a fewer number of musicians to make, if you will, a kind of bigger sound. But certainly in the early 1960s, if you were going to record a song, you needed a lot of musicians. You needed them to be likely in the same room. And
in the same room.
And they played
and
together.
maybe even with the singers, the band and the singers would all be on one tape, or maybe there were 2-track tapes being used for recording, but that was about it. That was the extent.
No, that really wasn't.
So you had to get all these people together at the same time, in the same place, the same studio. So these freelance musicians were on call, and if they got the call, they needed to get to the studio, and they all had to be there at the same time, and they had to do their thing. And studio time was a premium. It had to just work. It had to work. You had to get together. You had to do your thing and get out of there. They were expected to record 4 songs in 3 hours.
Exactly right.
And so you needed top-notch professionals. And if you knew you had somebody that could do it, you would want to have that person every time. And I think that the Wrecking Crew kind of started to gel as a group with Phil Spector.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Although the first germs of the Wrecking Crew probably even started in the 50s with Ricky Nelson, actually.
Yes, that's right.
Ricky Nelson, you had the legendary drummer Hal Blaine, and you had people like Bill Pittman,
yeah,
was one of the originals in that, and so they would get together and do this for Ricky Nelson, and starting off with the Ozzie and Harriet show. But that was the first time that they actually needed a backup band, needed some session players, and that's how that started out.
Yeah, that's right. And Ricky Nelson then became a kind of breakout teen idol in the late 1950s. These studio musicians, including Hal Blaine, actually toured a bit with Ricky Nelson. But it became clear to producers that if you were going to make a hit, you needed to get these studio musicians in Los Angeles. You needed to get them together. And I think it's clear that Phil Spector becomes the central feature of the Wrecking Crew, and in many ways a kind of, well, you can't really talk about the Wrecking Crew without Phil Spector. We have talked about Spector in a previous Behind the Curtain, but it is the case that Phil Spector died earlier this week, just a few days ago. Died while incarcerated in a California prison. And I suppose we should here just take a moment to think a little bit more about Phil Spector and his relationship with the Wrecking Crew, who by and large thought very highly of Phil Spector. They recognized his genius and his ability to his ability to get things done. But that's not. But Phil Spector had he was a peculiar guy, frankly, a kind of dangerous guy, and certainly the Wrecking Crew saw that. But Dave, you want to just talk a little bit about Spector, the early 1960s, the studio, the Wrecking Crew, what's going on there that sort of made this all come together?
Well, Phil Spector wasn't a disturbed individual. He was paranoid and had a number of issues, but he was also a genius. Um, Bill Pittman actually taught Phil Spector how to play guitar before he had his first hit. The first hit that he wrote and produced, "To Know Him Is to Love Him," and from there it kind of went on. Phil Spector had a unique production style that he called the wall of sound.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the wall of sound relied on just a lot of musicians being in the same place, playing at the same time. They played at the Gold Star studios, which were known for the echo chambers. So there was no there were no little spots of silence or anything anywhere in a Phil Spector. It was a big, big sound, and he achieved that by having literally dozens of session musicians come in and play. 3 or 4 pianists, 4 or 5 guitarists, playing on drums, and then like a dozen percussionists, things like this, in addition to having his singers then. And of course, that was to orchestrate all that was a huge job. But that was Phil Spector, and Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys talks about hearing "Be My Baby," one of the first hits that Phil Spector produced with the Ronettes.
Yeah.
While he was driving in his car, and he said he had to pull over because it was just unlike anything he had heard before. He said, "What is this?" And was just amazed. And he started hanging out at Gold Star, watching these sessions because he was just so fascinated by it.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that that it's Phil Spector that really, I guess, introduced Brian Wilson to the possibilities of the studio. And it's with Brian Wilson then hanging out at the studio with these session musicians, he learned the craft of recording. Up to this point, Wilson, this would be the quite early 60s, Wilson, he was writing songs, he was playing, of course, with the Beach Boys, but he was an ambitious guy and obviously an incredibly talented guy. And what he heard in the Spector recordings was that there was something that could be achieved in the studio that you couldn't necessarily achieve live. And so
there's an alternative version of his conversion to studio.
Okay.
Dean of Jan and Dean talks about how they had met and they'd done a little bit of work together with the Beach Boys in concert, things like that. And Brian Wilson said, "Okay, I'm working on 2 songs. Would you be interested in hearing them?" And I said, "Sure." And one of them was Surfing USA, the Chuck Berry ripoff, which, strangely enough, was the one that Brian Wilson wanted to concert. That was the one that he was working on. He says, "I have this other one, but I've already kind of lost interest. So it's a toss-off. If you want to have it, you can have it." And that was Surf City. So they took Surf City. They went into the studio with it. And Dean calls Brian and says, "You want to come over and listen to our cut?" "Sure." Yeah. He comes over and he listens to what they did with Surf City and was just blown away.
There we go.
Wow, that's my song. Yeah. We got these session guys here and they do it. They make that happen. And he said, "Wow, you could do that with your
that's pretty cool
group too. They don't have to do all the heavy lifting. These are the guys that know how it's done." So from that moment on, Brian Wilson wanted to also be working with that. That's the Dean version.
Yeah, and once Wilson makes his way into the studio, I don't know that he ever really leaves. he really in many ways sort of disconnects from the Beach Boys, at least in terms of sort of the live aspect of it. Well, I guess he remains a Beach Boy. He's very much wed to the studio. Of course, Wilson's genius comes, I think, to fullest fruition in the Pet Sounds LP, which was recorded with almost.
You know, that was released as a mono album.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was.
No stereo release
No stereo.
of Pet Sounds. And it sounds incredible today to say that, but originally, yeah, just mono.
And almost exclusively recorded with the musicians of the Wrecking Crew.
Of the Wrecking Crew, yeah.
I don't really even know how much the Beach Boys played on that album. Maybe just a bit. Certainly Dennis Wilson didn't play on it, but
Hal Blaine said that when Dennis Wilson made his solo album, that he came to Blaine to do the drum work. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, Dennis Wilson, one of the great characters of all time, the only Beach Boy who actually surfed. That solo album from the 70s, Pacific Ocean Blue, is actually really quite good. But the Pet Sounds is the product of the Wrecking Crew. Wilson in particular was enamored with Carol Kay's bass playing, but it's and the Wrecking Crew musicians have a lot of respect for Wilson, and I think
they love Brian Wilson,
and
they all you can't talk to any of them without them using the word genius, talking about Brian Wilson. And the Carol Kay admiration was absolutely mutual. She said,
yeah,
write out these charts that were just mind-blowing. He understood writing for like no one that she had ever seen.
Yeah, genius is tossed around a lot, but certainly Wilson was a genius, and certainly Phil Spector was a genius as well. And we would be remiss, I think, to not mention Spector. It is also the case, though, that Spector was, as you suggested, Dave, a very troubled individual, paranoid, dangerous, was convicted of manslaughter and had been incarcerated for almost a couple of decades. And it's also the case that Phil Spector had not really made really significant music since the early 1970s. I mean, it really wasn't a factor in the music business in any kind of meaningful way for 50 years. But that being said, that period of time in Los Angeles with the Wrecking Crew was a golden period. And certainly Phil Spector was a big part of that. And so when you talk about the Wrecking Crew, you have to mention Spector. You have to.
Because also, Spector was, people look at what Spector was doing and would say, okay, geez, those musicians, we've got to have them. So that was kind of the start of the huge popularity of the Wrecking Crew. And these people worked like 15-hour days, and they would go from Los Angeles to another, and start out at Capitol Records. They'd go to Gold Star, work with Spector. Then they might go to Western and do some Beach Boys stuff. End up at Columbia or Capitol or RCA or something like that. They would have several sessions a day. Like I said, these 3-hour sessions. And that was some union rule. A 3-hour session, and then it would be expected for them to get like 4 songs done in that time. So yeah, they were busy all the time.
Yeah, and it took its toll, and the accounts from the individual members of the Wrecking Crew do talk about the toll that it took on them personally, also it took on their families. It was really a very hard way to live, but they all recognized that they were in the midst of something just really quite amazing. And sometimes it's hard to get a sense of while you're in the middle of it. But I think even in the middle of it, they had a clear sense of it because all I had to do is turn on the radio, right? Because everything that was popular, almost everything that was popular, they had a hand in, right? And so it was this most amazing of times where they couldn't really work anymore. There were only so many hours in a day. And so many things that they were playing on really hit the charts in an amazing way. And so, but they were anonymous. right? They were completely anonymous. And that's one of the features of the Wrecking Crew that is, it's kind of odd in a way, but it is explainable, you know, that the public might have reacted negatively, probably would have reacted negatively to knowing that, in fact, every time they turned on the record, they were hearing the same, you know, it's Hal Blaine on the drums, it's Carol Kay on the bass, it's the same people playing, you know, because the public thought that their particular groups, right, were playing on their albums. I mean, I guess why wouldn't you think that? But there was a certain kind of strategy involved in keeping the Wrecking Crew kind of anonymous. In fact, to the point where a lot of times on the records, the Wrecking Crew wouldn't even be acknowledged having played. And so that certainly, that piece of it rubbed many of them the wrong way. I mean, they felt that they should be, you know, on the records on some way, but oftentimes they weren't.
Well, Tommy Todesco was absolutely cold about that. He said, you know, I'm doing my job, and you know, the guy pays me $25 and doesn't get a hit. I'm not going to give him his money back or ask him to take my name off a record. So when he does have a hit, it seems a little bit strange to. Anyway,
yeah.
But the funny thing about this for me is if you remember the Monkees and what kind of shitstorm they ended up going through because they didn't play their own record, their own instruments. It's so strange because almost none of the groups did. And, you know, it's different. You got a singer. It's clear he's got some kind of orchestra, no question about it, you know. But if you got a group out there and they're performing live on television or performing recorded on television, and they're playing guitars and so on, you might think that they actually were the people that recorded the instruments, but none of them did. And for some reason, the Monkees were the ones that got. Yeah, you know, you talk about the association, you talk about Mamas and Papas.
Oh, the Byrds. I mean, the list is endless.
Even the Byrds at the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Roger McGuinn talks about.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, the McGuinn story.
Well, he talks about, of course, the Mr. Tambourine Man. That's one of the famous stories. The Byrds went into the studio and their producer did not want them playing, except for McGuinn, who had even done some session work in New York before going to Los Angeles.
That's right.
And had a fantastic 12-string
the
guitar,
but jangle sound. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And just watching, just had damned to watch the session go on without them. And they sang their harmonies, and that was the extent of it. But McGuinn said, but the thing is, we got both of the cuts done in 3 hours, as opposed to our next hit, Turn, 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 the band did. It took 77 takes.
Yeah.
And that's the difference, you know, and as well. If you're going to take 77 takes, you better have a hit because you've spent a lot of money to get it.
Oh yeah, because production time, studio time was super expensive, right? And so there was a real logic to using the real in an economic sense. There was a real logic to using the Wrecking Crew because they were not only extraordinary, but they were also fast. I mean, they were really fast, and they were craftspeople. I mean, they just knew what they were doing, and they understood the economics of studio time. They weren't screwing around. They showed up on time. They did their job. I mean, in a way, it's very kind of almost kind of working class. They sort of clock in, clock out. I mean, they knew that the studio time was limited. They knew what their job was. They did their job because they also understood that if they were late, if they were, off key, if they were messing around, there'd be someone else to replace them. There are, hundreds of people in Southern California who can play and who are chomping at the bit to get some of these gigs. So you did your job in the Wrecking Crew, an affable group a fun group, but you were focused because studio
Yeah,
time.
absolutely. And the thing, producers, if they could not get that particular group of session players, they would wait until they were available before they would record. A lot of producers felt that way.
Yeah.
Either I get Hal Blaine and Carol Kay and Tommy Todesco, or we'll wait until I can get them.
That's right.
And Cher said she started seeing all this stuff. She was like 16 years old when she first went to the studio.
Right.
And when she first went to the studio, she was just kind of Sonny's girlfriend. He was an aide to Phil Spector. So he was in the studio helping Phil Spector out, and Cher was just kind of hanging around. And she said, you always saw the same people. It was always the same people. There were not any changes, same faces again and again. And she said at the time she was too stupid to realize what that meant, what the significance of that was, but she came to appreciate it later.
Yeah, the Cher's perspective on this is really quite interesting. As you said, she really is kind of a kid when she starts to sing backup and whatnot. And as is Sonny Bono's connection to all of this, as you suggest, Sonny Bono starts as a kind of assistant to Phil Spector. Again, a kind of affable guy. But what's interesting about Bono is that he learns the craft. It's Sonny Bono then that takes the lessons from Phil Spector and puts them into his own career, right? It's Sonny Bono understands the studio, he understands songwriting, he understands the business. And they make this kind of magnificent team. But Sonny and Cher are born directly from the Spector sessions, the Wrecking Crew sessions. They are, and they take those lessons and they implement them really quite remarkably.
Yeah, and so when you hear I Babe or the beat goes on, you know who the musicians are. It's the record.
That's for sure. That's for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's just a very vibrant period in pop music in the early to mid 1960s. And again, it's all really stemming from kind of one place, and that's Southern California, from a handful of studios in Los Angeles, and from really a handful of musicians, the Wrecking Crew.
Because the Wrecking Crew were so incredibly influential and played on hundreds of hit records.
Hundreds.
And listen, while we're talking about it, we need to mention, we're not just talking about hit records. We're not just talking about radio play. If you watched television, you were going to hear the Wrecking Crew.
Absolutely.
Bonanza. That was Tommy Todesco.
Yeah.
That was Wrecking Crew. So they were playing all this Mission Impossible, Batman. The vocal group that sang Batman. They had their chart and it said words and music by blah blah blah, and they crossed off the S on words. Word and music, because it was just the one word Batman over and over again. So,
I mean, what you're suggesting is that from a kind of cultural point of view, that soundtrack of American life in like 1964, 65, 66, and so on, the soundtrack of American life is really, it's the Wrecking Crew. That they're
absolutely.
You can hear them on radio, you can hear them on television. Many of these people also played on film soundtracks and that kind of thing. And so if there is music involved and it's the mid 60s, God, it's coming from the Wrecking Crew. It's coming from these handful of musicians in Los Angeles. It's really quite staggering to think about their reach. They're just everywhere.
Absolutely. And, even with groups like the Beatles, and we're not talking Wrecking Crew anymore, but the sound is getting so sophisticated. Of course, well known for anyone who's interested in rock history at all, that Pet Sounds by the Bee Gees were an inspiration for Sgt. Pepper.
Yeah, the Beach Boys. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, the Paul McCartney heard that and said, "That's just incredible. Let's try to beat that if we can." And so they came out with Sgt. Pepper's after that. But if you listen to Sgt. Pepper's, you're no longer listening to the four Beatles. You've got George Martin getting his symphony people in there and doing all sorts of stuff as well. So it's gotten bigger than one single group can do.
No question. Yeah, it very much the Wrecking Crew era very much sort of mirrors the great changes that are happening in recording and the taste with the public. And you mentioned the Beatles and George Martin. It is the case, of course, that we have also done a behind the curtain on George Martin, the so-called fifth Beatle, and we talked a little bit about his history with the group, as well as in his accomplishments in the recording industry, which are enormous. And in an interesting sort of way, there are parallels between George Martin and Phil Spector. Some parallels. Maybe it's just within the recording studio. I wouldn't want to push it past that. But yeah, the music is changing, and the Wrecking Crew in the studio, yeah, it's all a part of it. But there are some key individuals within the Wrecking Crew, particularly
Right.
guitarists, and we want to talk about some of these guitarists now, I think.
Yeah, because there really is so much to talk about. We're actually going to make an approach of splitting this into two sessions, two episodes. And the first one is primarily then dedicated to the guitarists of the Wrecking Crew. When we talk about Wrecking Crew guitarists, there's no getting around one particular figure, Tommy Todesco, who may well be the most recorded guitarists in history. I don't think there's any way of really knowing, but it seems more than likely that he is when you consider all of the things he was playing on. So here he is. This is Tommy Todesco, and just if you take a look at the things that he played on, you kind of get a feel for the scope of what the Wrecking Crew was doing. Todesco played on songs like MacArthur Park, earlier Dankeschön from Wayne Newton, Be My Baby, the song that inspired Brian Wilson, and Don't Worry Baby, the song that he wrote immediately after hearing Be My Baby. Guantanamera from the Sandpipers, Twisting the Night Away, Sam Cooke, Longfellow Serenade from Neil Diamond. He worked with people like we talked about Cher, Ella Fitzgerald, Nancy and Frank Sinatra, Strangers in the Night, Frank Sinatra alone, and then things like Something Stupid with both of them. And then just with Nancy alone, with These Boots. Talked about Rick Nelson already, Frank Zappa, Linda Ronstadt, Aretha Franklin, Joan Baez, Randy Newman, Kenny Loggins, Stephen Bishop, Quincy Jones, Leon Russell, J.J. Cale, Billy Preston, Paul Anka, Johnny Rivers, Mike Nesmith solo, Chet Baker, Bobby Darin, the Beach Boys, the Mamas and Papas, Everly Brothers, The Association, Barbra Streisand, Jan and Dean, Fifth Dimension, Elvis, and so on. And if Tommy Todesco is playing, there were bound to be other members of the Wrecking Crew. So you just get just an idea of the scope of what was going on there just by looking at the things that he was playing on.
It's an overwhelming list that you mentioned there, and you suggest. I mean, and I don't think it's an overstatement. He might be the most recorded guitarist of all time, and and the other thing about Todesco, it seems as though he was a kind of an emotional kind of key member of the Wrecking Crew, along with maybe Hal Blaine. Todesco had a lot of personality. He was somebody who I think people kind of leaned on. I think he was also a person who could kind of read the room, and if there was a needed to, if a joke was needed or something, that Todesco or the drummer Hal Blaine would be able to sort of put that in motion. There were leaders and followers within the Wrecking Crew, the individual musicians. It's clear that Todesco was a kind of leader, and people looked to him. He also was extremely influential. Guitarists looked at Todesco, tried to kind of copy what he was doing. A whole handful, right, of guitarists are in that Wrecking Crew, people like James Burton and Glenn Campbell. But Todesco really was a key member, maybe the key member of the Wrecking Crew. It's hard to sort of, they all were significant, but Todesco seemed to be really, really, really important.
There are a couple interesting stories around Gary Lewis and the Playboys. One of them is that their producer had them play their songs, and then said, well, we're just going to have it sweeten. We're going to sweeten it up a little bit with some session players. And Todesco was, of course, one of these guys, and he played a little Latin filler on "Sure Gonna Miss Her," and the guitar players. The guitarists from these groups and then drummers, they go in and they watch these sessions and just amazed at what they were hearing, saying, oh, well, there's no way we can do that. But they would watch and try to pick up what they could. Mickey Dolenz talked about going in and watching Hal Blaine, and the guitar player from the Playboys, the Playmates, what are they?
Playboys, yeah, you got
the Playboys. Yeah, Gary Lewis and the Playboys. He said, man, you play that, and then I'm going to have to go out there live and try to do something like it. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Raise the bar. Raise the bar.
Yeah, they really did.
Yeah. There was, I think, oftentimes, as you're suggesting here, these musicians from these groups would come in, be in the studio to sing the background and whatnot. They'd observe the musicians, and they recognized that they couldn't replicate what they were doing. Not really. And so it's the level of musicianship on albums and singles in the 1960s is elevated. It was elevated by people like Todesco and the other Wrecking Crew members. Had the groups been playing, the music wouldn't have been as good.
The Monkees were also kind of split in terms of what their expectations were. Mickey Dolenz and Davy Jones went in there thinking, okay, we're going to be actors in a show about a fictitious band. And Mike Nesmith and Peter Tork went in thinking, well, we're going to become a band and we're going to be recording stuff. And so they actually went to the first recording sessions, and the producers were like, well, what are you doing here? Well, this is our recording session, right? He said, oh, it's over, go home. And they were very upset about that because of the expectations. And Peter Tork said, well, it was naivety on my part because we had no clue of what we were doing, and there's no way we could have made records at that point.
Right.
We kind of had to see what was going on to understand that.
That's right. And I think Tork also says that were he in charge of a similar kind of project, he probably would have done it that way, have these professional musicians,
now he would. Absolutely.
Yeah, this is what you needed to do. But at the time it was painful. It was painful to not really be playing on your record. And also kind of embarrassing, I think, in a way. But, that's how the game was played in the 1960s in Los Angeles, for sure. Now, of course, that didn't stay like that forever, but there was this period, early 60s to mid to sort of late 60s, where the Wrecking Crew ruled supreme.
Yeah. So we have Tommy Todesco, and of course he was doing the TV things and soundtrack things too. He played on Godfather, Jaws, Deer Hunter, Rio Lobo, and played on Green Acres, the Green Acres theme.
Which is which we don't have it here. We'll probably put it on the playlist, but it does kind of in a weird sort of way kind of rock There's
I
some,
love that theme.
there's some screaming little guitar in there. It's just, it really cooks in its own sort of corn pone way. Yeah, for sure.
Dun, 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 dun. Okay, so the green played on MASH, Mission Impossible, Mannix, Twilight Zone. So anyway, that's Tommy Tudero. He was Steve, as you say, it was he was kind of the leader of
Seemed to be.
not just the guitarist, but of the
Seemed to
record
be.
crew.
Yeah, seemed to be a key figure in the room.
And he was a very giving sort of guy too, because he would say, well, you know, I'm not going to be able to play on that, but why don't you talk to so and so, or okay, that's the 12-string part. You know, you play a 12-string better than I do. Al Casey talks about that.
Right.
It says that I'm supposed to be here number one, but that's 12 string. So you do that, and I'll do this other part. Things like that. So he was
Things
just
like
a
that.
pretty decent guy.
Absolutely.
Just a little bit of trivia. He was on the Gong Show. Are you familiar with that?
I am familiar with it.
Played Requiem for a studio guitar player in a tutu.
In a tutu. And he was a large man.
Yes, so a little pink tutu playing the song, and he won that episode of the Gong Show with his
which in a bizarre sort of way, backhanded sort of way, was as much notoriety as he ever got.
That is very strange. And Frank Zappa said, you know, the tutu kind of distracted from it, but if you listen to the lyrics, which he said, that explains exactly what studio musicians went through. That's what it tells the story.
It absolutely does. We'll have to put that on the playlist. It really does. I mean, the tutu was distracting, but he actually had something to say while he was up there. And you know,
Frank Zappa, like so many other talented musicians and guitarists, really loved what the session players from the Wrecking Crew.
Yeah, and that's high praise, because Zappa was, I mean, a very peculiar kind of personality and all that, but a very exacting musician. And his music is extremely complex, and he had very, very high standards, and was quite frankly very tough on the people who played with him. And so to get praise from Frank Zappa really meant, I mean, that was a big deal. And Zappa recognized the genius with the Wrecking Crew, the great ability that they had, and Todesco was right up there amongst them.
Maybe say a little bit about Glenn Campbell.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Glenn Campbell from Arkansas, from Delight, Arkansas. I think Glenn Campbell is a relatively well-known figure in American popular music. Glenn Campbell, who passed away in 2013, is a kind of child prodigy, quite frankly. Grew up in rural Arkansas. He was given a guitar at an early age, roughly around 5. Began to play pretty quickly. He was a part of a kind of musical family. And but Glenn Campbell, strictly speaking, wasn't he played by ear, basically. He could read music, but he was not trained in that regard. And so his ear was impeccable. And basically, if you could play something for Campbell once or twice, he could just take it from there.
Just really quickly,
yeah.
Either you had, in the Wrecking Crew, you had people who could read music and read music well, who could just sit down and look at a chart and just go, or you had people like Glenn Campbell who just needed to hear it once or twice and could run with it.
That's right. No, that's absolutely right. And so Campbell's one of those people that had this gifted ear. He kind of paid his dues, though. You know, as a young guy, as a teenager, he moved to Mexico and played in a band, a kind of country dance band his uncle ran. And he played out in New Mexico in the Arizona Southwest region for roughly about 5 years or so before making his way to Los Angeles. And so by the time he gets to LA, he is in his early 20s. He has a great gift, but he's kind of casting about for what to do. Glenn Campbell was blessed with kind of movie star looks. And so, frankly, unlike many of the people in the Wrecking Crew, Glenn Campbell looked like a star. He really did look like a star. He had a pretty good voice, and again, he had this great ability to play guitar. And so he did record early in the 60s. He didn't really have any hits. And what ended up happening with Campbell was that he kind of backed away from a kind of recording career and made his living on as a session musician. And so he worked as a session musician for several years with the Wrecking Crew. So he was in the mix with everybody, you know, a session here, a session there, as you described earlier, Dave. That's how the days were filled. He did have an encounter with Brian Wilson, and because the Wrecking Crew did, in fact, you know, play on some of the Beach Boys albums, there was this kind of synergy there. It is also the case that Campbell was a Beach Boy for a short time. It replaced Wilson at a couple of stages along the way, and so he was on the stage with the other Beach Boys, and so again, it kind of gave him a kind of
once he spent some time with the Beach Boys and had toured with them a bit, he understood why Brian wanted to go with some studio musicians, just because he said it's impossible to imagine these guys in the studio. They fought like cats and dogs.
Yes.
So it was just like, well, you know, you can't spend studio time just sniping.
Absolutely. It's hard to imagine any group that could even be functional with Mike Love in it. Mike Love's a difficult guy, but yeah, the Beach Boys fought like cats and dogs. They fought like brothers, but it gave Campbell a sense of the possibilities. He was playing
bass in those tours and so on, and
that's right.
Terribly comfortable with bass. And he said that Al Jardin saved his skin on more than one occasion. I'm not sure it's somewhat opaque comment, but that's what he said.
Well, Campbell is, he had a kind of personality, a kind of bubbly personality, and a very kind of warm affect. And again, kind of movie star looks, to be frank, but you know, it really was a pairing with a songwriter from Oklahoma, a guy by the name of Jimmy Webb, that really helped to sort of launch Campbell's career. And it's the case that the Campbell Webb pairings, you know, created some of the most memorable songs in
fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, something like Galveston, for example, is just, you know, it's just.
By the time I get to Phoenix.
The Wichita Lineman. Yeah. The Campbell. Okay. So Campbell, for what it's worth, I mean, in terms of chart success as a solo artist, I mean, he hits the top 10 with the Wichita Lineman, with Galveston. It's Only Make Believe. Then in the mid 70s, he hits the number one with Rhinestone Cowboy and also Southern Lights. You know, Campbell also, for a short period of time in the late 60s, early 70s, had his own television show, the Glenn Campbell Good Time Hour, a summer replacement for the Smothers Brothers. And that, you know, in the 60s and in the 70s, if you were on television, you were a star. And so, I mean, Glenn Campbell was everywhere. He was everywhere in the late 60s and into the 70s.
Talks about going through an airport shortly after his first show. And people would say, "Yeah, hey, Glenn. How do these people know me?" It didn't even occur to him what kind of effect television had, just how big it was.
It was enormous. And the other thing about Campbell was that for a short period of time, he was a movie star. He appeared in the
True Grit
alongside, here you can see, alongside John Wayne and Kim Darby. And while I think it's safe to say that he had modest acting chops, True Grit was a hit. And it really cemented his place as a kind of all-around performer. There was something about Campbell that seemed, well, I don't know. He seemed like he could do almost everything. And so in that regard, he harkened back to an earlier era where performers, you know, they could tell a joke, they could sing, they could dance, this kind of thing. He was really a very versatile versatile performer, but at his heart, he was a guitar player. And quite frankly, he was a guitar player's guitar player. And those chops were finally honed in the Wrecking Crew. It's the case that Campbell's life, had peaks and valleys. He had numerous battles with substance abuse, famously stormy relationship with Tanya Tucker. But I think through it all, people recognized his blinding talent. And even though the hits stopped coming after the 1970s, the admiration for Campbell by guitar players and by musicians in general, I mean, it never stopped. And Campbell's life, again, came to an end in 2017, and he struggled with dementia in the latter years of his life for him quite bravely. But he was still, he could even at the end, when Campbell really struggled to communicate and struggled to recognize people, he still could play the guitar. And that was really his essence really was was music and the guitar. And so I suspect, I think it's undeniable that Campbell is the most famous of the musicians that come from the Wrecking Crew, certainly the most famous of the guitarists, although again, Todesco and many others are really significant. But Glenn Campbell was entertainment for a period of maybe 5 to 6 years, and he comes straight from the studios alongside Todesco and Carol Kay and Hal Blaine and the like,
and continued to use them on his own albums, of course.
Yeah, and certainly in the 60s and early 70s, he continued to use them. Curiously, later in the 70s, he started to use his own band, and the members of the Wrecking Crew sort of understood that, and they weren't embittered by that on any way. But that must have been quite a moment for the Wrecking Crew to be playing with one of their own on hits. That must have been Galveston, Wichita Lineman, and those kinds of things. That must have been really something for them all to be together and to see one of their own, take the mantle. And
I guess there was a lot of good natured that went on there.
Undoubtedly, no question about that. That seemed to be that'd be my sense as well.
So 1971 was probably about the end of the session player era. I think a lot of these people tried to find gigs then in touring bands or, for instance, one of these guys from the Wrecking Crew kind of made his own as James Burton was he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2001. But in the later years, in the 70s and so on, he was playing with Elvis in Vegas, touring with Emmylou Harris, touring with John Denver, and then became kind of a part of John Denver's band. It's a studio band, of course, and touring band. But so he started off, though, also at Ricky Nelson's band while he was still a teenager. And James Burton, again, when you talk about the Wrecking Crew, you don't hear a lot about him, but he was ranked number 19 in the Rolling Stones 100 greatest guitarists. So that type of person working in there.
Yeah, incredible talent. Incredible.
So again, you had to find where you were going to go, and by the time the work ended for the session players, some of them didn't need to work anymore. They became wealthy. At one point, Hal Blaine had a Rolls Royce, a yacht, 23-room mansion, all these things. Of course, he got a divorce that just about took everything he had.
Yeah, I mean,
and ended up working as a security guard down in Phoenix. But
yeah, I mean, but his is a cautionary tale for sure. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Carol Kay talks about that at one point. She talks about how she's making more money than the president. I mean, it is the case that the studio work was yeah was profitable, and they became wealthy. Many of them became wealthy, and they didn't have to work. But I do think though that there was a real longing and a real kind of sadness, a kind of emptiness once those studio gigs began to dry up. That's the nature of the business, and they were the first to acknowledge that studio musicians' time in the sun is relatively brief, and that people go on to other studio musicians, or in this case, technology becomes um, more available. But they recognized even when they were in the middle of it, they were living in a golden moment. They just knew it, that this was a special time. It couldn't last forever.
yeah, and as we said, there were a number of reasons why session players were so in demand in the 60s, and certain reasons why that demand dried up after or in the early 70s.
That's right. That's right.
And they're of course very related. Let's just talk about a few more of the guitarists
Yeah, go for it. Let's do it.
that were involved. Al Casey is a name that's often mentioned.
Yeah.
Al Casey was, and a lot of these musicians, guitarists and everybody else, will say their first love was jazz music, jazz guitarists, jazz drumming, saxophone, that sort of thing. But the music industry was going in the direction of rock and roll, and so they learned how to play it. And
Right.
some of them enjoyed playing rock and roll, and some of them didn't so much. But they learned how, and they became very good at it. Yeah. So Al Casey was actually a kind of a rockabilly type of, his own nature, and he actually had like 3 top 100 hits on his own.
He did. Yeah.
He started off playing in shows with Alan Freed, Dick Clark, their rock shows that were going on. He was one of their guitarists. Played with Duane Eddy and the Rebels for a while.
Yeah.
And wrote one of their biggest hits, Ramrod. And Ramrod was kind of an afterthought. They had been playing, I think, for Dick Clark or something. It was live television.
Okay. Yeah.
Their set was over, and Dick Clark said, "Guys, we're on live television, and we're short about 3 minutes. Do you have anything else that you can play?" So they went out and played Ramrod. And shortly after that, Duane Eddy got a call from Lee Hazelwood saying, "They're asking me, they're placing orders for this song, and we don't have a record. We need to get a record out so we can fill these orders."
That's wild.
But they were touring, and Duane Eddy said, "Well, in about 3 weeks we'll be back in Los Angeles." He said, "I need it now." So they had some other session players doing it, and I'm not sure exactly how it worked, but this was one of the least best kept secrets in the music business. But at some point, apparently Duane Eddy actually convinced himself that they had recorded it, and was very upset when Al Casey admitted years and years later that they had not actually.
That's so wild. Duane Eddy was, he certainly had his moment in the late 50s, early 60s, kind of teenage idol, and a very kind of influential guitarist. His tuning, Glenn Campbell was really influenced by Duane Eddy, his style. And the tuning of Campbell's guitar on Galveston, which is quite distinctive, kind of low, and is very Eddy-esque. He was almost a kind of straight copy of Duane Eddy. And you mentioned Lee Hazelwood. Lee Hazelwood was a producer and also a kind of performer. And he famously paired himself with Nancy Sinatra in the late 1960s, and recorded a couple of albums that are actually really quite interesting. But Lee Hazelwood and Nancy Sinatra, you know, they utilized, of course, Wrecking Crew musicians, and so, you know, when it's actually a really small world, right, where somebody calls a producer,
Yes.
you know, there's this sort of interconnectedness that is just really quite, it's really quite remarkable. For this period, this decade-long period, you know, everybody worked with everybody, knew everybody, and yeah.
Well, as long as we're talking about Lee Hazelwood and Nancy Sinatra, one of the songs that the Wrecking Crew played on, These Boots, was a song that Lee Hazelwood wrote.
Yes.
And was singing.
It was singing.
Yeah, and Nancy Sinatra said, I'd like to do that song. And he said, oh, it's not a woman's song. And she said, well, it's certainly not a man's song. Or as a man singing that, you sound abusive and cruel. But when a little girl sings, it sounds empowering, and it's the right song for women to do. And
you know,
that was her biggest hit, right?
It was her biggest hit. You know, and she had really good instincts about music. It's she was absolutely right about that song. You know, the Nancy Sinatra output in the 60s and early 70s is really interesting. And it's really interesting. I know she's under the shadow of her dad, and certainly benefited from the name connection and all that. But she had talent on her own. And those albums with Lee Hazelwood are really good. They're really, really good. Yeah.
And watching her interviews, she seems like a really likable person as well. Just
honestly, I'd agree with you completely. And she's very in tune with what's happening politically. She's a very, very sharp woman, extremely sharp woman. And I think it's easy to dismiss Nancy Sinatra as, you know, whatever, Frank's kid, and, you know, got all those advantages and all that kind of thing. She's solid. She's solid. So
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And These Boots, I think, is a great illustration of her instincts. She knew what she was doing.
Just to finish up with Al Casey. Al Casey played with people like Beach Boys, of course, Elvis, The Association, Johnny Cash, Eddie Arnold, Harry Nilsson, Partridge Family, Simon and Garfunkel, and
yes.
Of course he was part of the Wall of Sound as well, of course.
Yeah, he played everywhere. But like you mentioned,
in the later years, he actually played 3 years on the Dean Martin Show band.
Yeah, so. And Dean Martin leaned pretty heavily on the Wrecking Crew. It's so interesting that you mentioned that Casey wasn't all that, you know, okay, you know, he's a jazz guy and this rock and roll, okay, you know, it paid the bills. It paid the bills. It's fascinating though. I mean, that goes, I think, there's a certain kind of work ethic involved with the Wrecking Crew musicians, with the guitarists in particular, that's just like, yeah, okay, you know, this is what I got to do. And they did it really quite well. But was it their win?
Well, Al Casey was actually inducted into the Rockabilly Hall of Fame. You know, so
that's something, isn't it?
Sort of power guitarists we're talking about here.
No kidding. Yeah.
Howard Roberts, another Wall of Sound guitarist. Again, the Wall of Sound required that you have 5 or 6 guitarists. So if you're getting the best guitarists,
yeah,
in LA, of course they're going to become members of the Wrecking Crew. Roberts was born in Phoenix in 1950, and he went to LA when he was 21. Did a lot of work with television themes.
Okay.
He played the lead on the Twilight Zone theme.
Oh yeah.
Played I Love Lucy, Munsters, Brady Bunch, Gilligan's Island, Get Smart, Beverly Hillbillies, Griffith, Peter Gunn. Peter Gunn theme, of course, written by
Mancini.
Henry
Mancini, yeah, absolutely.
Lost in Space, Dragnet, Wild Wild West, The Odd Couple, Dick Van Dyke, I Dream of Jeannie. So
again, I mean, Howard Roberts, another example. This is, you know, He's the soundtrack of popular culture in the late 60s and early 1970s. I mean, these guitarists, these musicians were on everything, you know. So if you were, you know, television, radio, film, they were everywhere. And it's another example of it. Yeah.
He also played with Dean Martin, Eddie Cochran, Peggy Lee, Roy Clark, Monkees, Chet Atkins, and the Electric Prunes. A little
the Electric Prunes.
Things started getting psychedelic.
Oh man, for sure. You know, if he's playing with Chet Atkins, that means, Chet Atkins is another, you know, good Nashville guy and famous Nashville session musician as well. Yeah, guitarist. Yeah. What's interesting about the Wrecking Crew is that they went from one to the next, and they took a certain, it was very different. I mean, it's, you know, it's, you're paying for Peggy Lee, and then you're playing for the Electric Prunes. Conceivably, you could be doing that in the same afternoon. But yet they took the same kind of pride and work ethic to each of these sessions, and they did what they needed to do, whether it was 3 chords or something complex. They just, yeah, amazing stuff.
And another thing that made them so incredibly loved and appreciated by the producers was that you could lay a basic chart in front of them with some chords. You know, that was that kind of guidelines. And then they would get creative and inventive. Exactly. And some of the most famous guitar riffs that you hear, and oh man, that's just something that they invented on the spur of the moment for songs that they were playing to make it more interesting, just because they thought it would be better that way, and it was. And that was that sort of thing that they could bring to the game was irreplaceable, you know.
Yeah, and it was the wise producer and the wise engineer and the wise composer that would allow them that kind of freedom, recognizing that these people had, you know, great gifts. And okay, so it wasn't just play the notes on the page, but where there was room for improvisation, where there was room for creativity, you gave them that room because they knew what they were doing, and they were so often right, you know, just a lick here or just a little riff there, and it made the difference in a song. No question.
Just one example, Wichita Lineman.
Yes, it's a classic example.
Says to Campbell, he said, well, you know, why don't we start it off with just this little intro? She just played on her piece, and then and it's a fantastic intro for a fantastic song. But you know, that just sets up the song in a great way. And
no, you're exactly
they were doing
right.
that sort of thing all the time for all sorts of hits.
All the time. And so this is, I mean, their great genius was that they had the ability to, in just a handful of notes, just to really, you know, just make the song. I mean, I think the Carol Kay example in Wichita Lineman, that's it. I mean, that interesting intro just, you know, just lays open the landscape for this incredible song.
She says she walked into a drugstore one time and they were playing that, started playing Wichita Lineman. Tears came to her eyes because she was just so proud of that record.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that thing must have happened all the time to the Wrecking Crew.
You would think, yeah. That they.
I mean, just think that.
One of the, I'm not sure which of these guys said it, but he said, you know, a lot of people talk about the big instant gratification that you get as a musician is going out and playing live for a crowd. There's that instant, you know, rapport and
right.
But it says for me, it's playing, making a cut, and going into the sound booth and hearing the replay and just say, oh yes, oh we got it.
That's it.
You know, that is it.
And that's it. No, that's it. It's a very There's this and the recognizing what they've accomplished. It's just right there in the moment. It's just really something cool. Absolutely.
One other thing about these guitarists, they could play just about anything that had strings, you know. A lot of them can play sitar, which is amazing. But mandolin, bass if they needed to, but rhythm and lead, of course. A lot of them could play ukulele, banjo, just whatever was needed. So they were very versatile as well, which also made them very valuable in the studio. But
no
just
question.
a few more names, just throwing out there. It was also Billy Strange was an important player for the Wrecking Crew. Lewis Shelton, Bill Pittman, mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So there was a core of like 8 to 10 guitarists that were just working all the time, and for like 8 years straight.
Yeah, and oftentimes working together. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and again, you would see the same people again and again, and they do a session and then meet again an hour and a half later at a different studio and do it again.
So, you know, it's the Wrecking Crew it's a lot to take on. I mean, there are a lot of people involved, and there are probably people involved that would be surprising, I think. But when we look first at the guitarist, that's just kind of a place to start. We have an idea that we'd like to expand this a little bit more, right, Dave, and talk about other people who were involved in the Wrecking Crew, other musicians, maybe other engineers as well, who also made their mark.
Absolutely. Yeah, because there are a few people that you just can't talk about the Wrecking Crew without mentioning them. Hal Blaine and Carol Kay, people like that, and a whole bunch of other people that really you've never heard of, but made significant contributions.
Yeah,
so.
whose names may be unfamiliar, but whose music you'll recognize. And so we look forward to being able to do that in an upcoming episode of Behind the Curtain. And that we were really happy to be able to talk about the guitarists today. And also, once again, to mention the contributions of Phil Spector, who died in January of 2021.
Yeah, that's right. So we hope you'll join us for the second half of the Wrecking Crew, and appreciate you joining us this time.
Absolutely.
You can subscribe to our channel right here, or check out another one of the Behind the Curtains documentaries, perhaps Phil Spector, right here. And a playlist, and the playlist for today is I think going to be particularly interesting, particularly special. So I highly recommend it. You can check that out here. It's also down below in the comments.
That's right. So we thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.